In April of 1942, the strangest sight in the Pacific was not a battleship. It was 16 Army bombers tied down on the deck of a Navy aircraft carrier. They were too big for that deck, they were too heavy for that mission, and they were being asked to do something no bomber crew had ever been asked to do before. Take off from the sea, strike Japan, and disappear into China before the fuel ran out. The raid would not destroy Japan. It would not cripple its factories. It would not even come close, but it would do something more dangerous. It would prove that the sky had become a front line, and once that happened, war would never shrink back to the battlefield again. Just 4 months earlier, the United States had been hit at Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft tore into the American fleet at Oahu. Battleships burned, harbor water filled with oil. The shock went beyond the damage. America had not just been attacked, America had been reached. Then the map began to move. The Philippines fell under pressure. Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies were swallowed in rapid succession. Japanese forces pushed across an enormous arc of ocean, jungle, island, and coastline. To Washington, it felt as if the Pacific had no walls. The United States was angry, but anger did not solve distance. In early 1942, America did not yet have airfields close enough to bomb Japan. Its industrial machine was waking up, but not fully awake. Its fleet had been wounded. Its armies were still moving into position, so the planners reached for an idea that sounded almost absurd. If bombers could not reach Japan from land, they would launch them from a carrier. The mission went to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a pilot who understood machines the way gamblers understand risk. He chose the B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine Army bomber with a short enough wingspan to fit the impossible plan. The aircraft were stripped down. Extra fuel was loaded. Crews practiced short takeoffs until the margin between success and death felt like a measurement they could hear in the engines. Then USS Hornet carried the bombers west, hidden in plain sight on her flight deck. The plan was precise: get close, launch, bomb military and industrial targets in Japan, fly onward to friendly airfields in China. But precision rarely survives first contact with the ocean. A Japanese picket boat spotted the task force before it reached the planned launch point. Suddenly the crews were still hundreds of miles farther from Japan than they were supposed to be. There was no safe choice left. Doolittle launched. One by one, the B-25s rolled toward the bow of the Hornet. Their wheels hammered across a deck built for lighter Navy planes. The ocean opened ahead. The carrier rose and dipped beneath them. Then the first bomber lifted off with almost nothing to spare. And with that, the old geography of war cracked. The raid hit Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other targets. The physical destruction was limited. The bomb loads were light. The crews could not return to the carrier. Most of them crash-landed or bailed out over China. Several men died. 8 fell into Japanese hands. Some were executed. 1 died in captivity. And the Chinese regions that helped the raiders paid terribly. Japanese forces swept through areas where the aircraft had come down, destroying airfields and punishing civilians with brutal reprisals. That is the shadow beneath the legend. The Doolittle Raid was not a clean miracle. It was a psychological weapon with a human cost spread far beyond the men who flew it. But inside Japan, it landed exactly where no bomb map could measure. The Empire had built a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. It had believed that distance, islands, fleet power, and momentum could keep the homeland safe. 16 medium bombers showed otherwise, not because they destroyed much, because they arrived at all. That was the first lesson of 1942. Air power did not need to win a battle to change a war. Sometimes it only had to break the belief that a place was unreachable. Across the world, Britain was reaching a different conclusion. Before American armies landed in France, Britain had very few ways to hit Germany directly. The Royal Navy could blockade. The army could fight in North Africa. But if Britain wanted to carry the war into the heart of the Reich, the main tool was the bomber. In February 1942, Arthur Harris took command of RAF Bomber Command. His problem was not ambition. His problem was accuracy. British crews had been sent deep over Germany, often at night, trying to strike factories, rail yards, and industrial targets. But the technology of the moment was not good enough to make precision reliable. Cloud, darkness, navigation errors, German fighters, and radar-directed flak turned every raid into a dangerous approximation. So Harris pushed toward a harsher answer. If the bombers could not reliably strike one factory, they would strike the city around it. It was a change in method. It was also a change in morality. Operation Millennium was designed to show what Bomber Command could become. The target was Cologne. The number was the message. 1,000 bombers. Not because Britain normally had that many ready in frontline service. It did not. Aircraft were pulled from training units and conversion units. Anything that could fly and carry bombs was pressed into the stream. On the night of May 30th, 1942, the sky over Cologne filled with aircraft. German defenses were formidable. Searchlights, radar, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, night fighters waiting in the dark. But the bomber stream created a new kind of problem. Instead of arriving as scattered aircraft, the force came in mass. The raid compressed time. It flooded defenses. It turned the sky into a moving corridor of engines, contrails, flame, and metal. In roughly 90 minutes, hundreds of aircraft dropped more than 1,000 tons of bombs. Incendiaries opened fires. High explosives tore roofs, streets, rails, and water lines apart. Fire crews were overwhelmed. Civil defense struggled to understand where the next wave was coming from before the last one had finished burning. Cologne was not a battlefield in the old sense. It was a city. That was the terrible truth strategic bombing forced into the center of the war. Factories were inside cities. Rail junctions ran through neighborhoods. Industrial workers were civilians. And once the bomber became the tool of national pressure, the line between war production and civilian life became thinner with every raid. German propaganda called the attack pointless cruelty. Opponents of Hitler inside Germany placed the blame on the Nazi regime that had unleashed the war in the first place. Both things can sit uneasily beside each other. The raid did not end German production. It did not break the Reich, but it did prove that Britain could assemble and deliver mass air power at a scale Germany could not ignore. Another belief had been broken, not the belief that islands protected a homeland. This time, the belief that a city behind the lines was still behind the war. But in the Pacific, aircraft were not only rewriting cities, they were killing the age of the battleship. For centuries, sea power had been imagined as ships meeting ships, big guns, armor, flags on the horizon, commanders seeing the enemy before destroying him. Then came the Battle of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, Japan moved toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. Taking it would threaten the supply line between the United States and Australia. American codebreakers in Hawaii read enough of the Japanese plan to warn Admiral Chester Nimitz that something was coming, so he sent the carriers Lexington and Yorktown south. What followed was a naval battle in which the opposing surface ships never fired directly at one another. They did not need to see each other. Their aircraft did the seeing. Their aircraft did the striking. Their aircraft carried the decision over the horizon. Both sides made mistakes. Reconnaissance reports were confused. Pilots attacked the wrong targets. Commanders made decisions with incomplete pictures over a vast ocean, but the meaning was unmistakable. At Coral Sea, naval warfare became aerial warfare. The United States lost Lexington. Yorktown was damaged. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho, while Shokaku was damaged and Zuikaku's air group was badly depleted. On paper, Japan could claim a tactical success, but the invasion of Port Moresby was stopped. That mattered. Coral Sea was not the final turn of the Pacific War. It was the first punch that made the second punch possible. The second punch came at Midway. Midway was small enough to vanish on a classroom map, a thin atoll in the Central Pacific. But its position made it enormous. For Japan, Midway could extend the defensive perimeter and draw out the remaining American carriers. For Nimitz, it was a chance to turn intelligence into ambush. American codebreakers had again given him the most valuable thing in the Pacific, not more ships. Time. They knew roughly where the blow was coming. They knew what Japan wanted, and they had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Japan's carrier force was powerful, experienced, and dangerous. Its pilots had been among the best in the world. Its Zero fighters were deadly. Its attack doctrine had stunned the Allies from Pearl Harbor onward. But the same force had a weakness. It could strike hard. It could not easily absorb disruption while preparing the next strike. Carrier decks are not just runways. They are exposed workshops full of fuel, bombs, torpedoes, hoses, crews, and aircraft waiting for the next order. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft hit Midway. The damage was real but not decisive. Then reports arrived of American ships nearby. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a nightmare of timing. Recover the planes returning from Midway, rearm aircraft for another attack on the island, switch weapons for a carrier strike, launch immediately, wait. Every choice consumed minutes, and in carrier warfare minutes were not time, they were ammunition. American torpedo bombers came in low and suffered brutally. Many were shot down. Their sacrifice did not sink the carriers, but it pulled Japanese fighters down. It bent attention toward the sea. Then the SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived from above. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning: Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu. Bombs hit aircraft, fuel lines, and armed ordnance on deck. Hangars became furnaces. The heart of Japan's carrier striking force caught fire almost at once. Later that day, American dive bombers found Hiryu and hit her too. By the time the battle was over, Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced sailors, pilots, mechanics, and deck crews. The ships mattered. The pilots mattered more. The lost instructors, maintainers, and veterans could not be replaced quickly. Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it ended the period when Japan could dictate its direction. And again, the lesson was the same. The aircraft had become the decision-maker, not the battleship, not the old line of sight, not even the island itself. The sky decided who could move. In the Soviet Union, air power showed a different face, not reach, not surprise, not carrier warfare. Destruction. In the summer of 1942, Germany turned south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. At the same time, the city of Stalingrad became a political, industrial, and symbolic objective. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe struck. Junkers, Ju-88s, Heinkel He 111s, and other aircraft pounded the city. Government buildings, rail links, communications, water systems, oil tanks, factories, streets, and housing were hit. Fires rose through the city. Smoke climbed in black columns over the Volga. The bombing killed tens of thousands and shattered Stalingrad's center. But here, air power produced one of the war's cruelest ironies. The Luftwaffe helped destroy the city so thoroughly that it made the city harder for the German army to take. Wide streets became rubble corridors. Ruined buildings became strongpoints. Cellars became bunkers. Collapsed factories became fortresses. The terrain no longer favored tanks and fast armored movement. It favored men fighting from room to room, floor to floor, stairwell to stairwell. The German army had come to seize a city. The bombing helped create a maze, and the Red Army used that maze. Soviet commanders fed in enough men and material to keep the Sixth Army locked in brutal close combat. The fight became a grinder. Every block cost blood. Every factory name became a battlefield. By November, the Soviets were ready for the counterstroke. Operation Uranus hit the weaker Axis forces on the flanks and wrapped around the German Sixth Army. Suddenly, the army that had fought its way into Stalingrad was trapped inside it. Then air power was asked to do something else: feed an army. Hermann Göring promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded forces by air. But a promise is not a cargo hold. 250,000 men needed food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, winter clothing, and replacement parts. Germany did not have enough proper transport aircraft to meet that need. Bombers like the Heinkel He 111 were pressed into transport duty. But bomb bays are not warehouses. They were not built for bulk supply. The weather was brutal. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns closed in. Airfields were lost. Aircraft broke down. Crews flew into a shrinking pocket and often did not come back. The Luftwaffe that had helped turn Stalingrad into ruins could not keep the German army alive in those ruins. The failure was not only operational, it was symbolic. Air power could terrorize, it could reach, it could burn, it could disrupt, but it could not perform miracles when strategy had trapped an army beyond rescue. The same year that showed the bomber's power also exposed its limits. And Germany's limits were not only in the air, they were in the factory. By 1942, the front line no longer ran only through deserts, oceans, islands, and ruined cities. It ran through assembly plants. Nowhere made that clearer than Willow Run in Michigan. Henry Ford's company built a vast plant to produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber designed for long-range and heavy payloads. The B-24 could fly far, carry thousands of pounds of bombs, and serve across the European and Pacific theaters. It was not beloved by every crew. It was vulnerable in ways the men inside it understood very well. Fuel leaks, flak damage, and hard ditching characteristics gave the aircraft a harsh reputation. But the B-24 did not have to be perfect to matter. It had to exist in numbers the Axis powers could not match. At first, Willow Run struggled. Building cars and building bombers were not the same problem. A bomber was not a Model T with wings. It required specialized airframe methods, trained workers, precision systems, and constant coordination. But once the plant adapted, the scale became staggering. Tens of thousands of workers moved through shifts. Women entered industrial jobs in huge numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter but made real by hands on rivet guns, wiring fixtures, gauges, and aluminum skin. Industrial leaders were pulled into government service. Civilian automobile production was halted. Detroit and other manufacturing centers were redirected toward war. Bombers became a measure of national power. Not one machine, a system, engines, aluminum rubber, fuel, training bases, runways, navigation schools, gunners, spare parts, pilots, weather reports, convoys, railcars, factories running through the night. That was the Allied advantage taking shape. Germany could design remarkable aircraft, including machines that looked advanced on paper. But design without reliable production is only a drawing, and production without a stable doctrine can become waste. The Heinkel He 177 became an example of that problem. Intended as a heavy bomber, it was burdened by a requirement that made little sense for its size: dive bombing ability. Its coupled engine arrangement created chronic overheating and fire risks. Crews gave it a grim nickname for a reason. A bomber that burns itself is not a strategy. Across the Atlantic, the American answer was less elegant and more decisive. Build, train, ship, fuel, repair, replace, repeat. By the time the B-29 Superfortress emerged, the bomber had become something larger than an aircraft. It was the visible tip of an industrial civilization organized for total war. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun systems, longer reach, higher cost, greater destructive possibility. The machine was changing again, but the real transformation had already happened. By the end of 1942, air power had touched every part of the war. It had struck a homeland for psychological effect. It had burned cities to attack morale and production. It had turned carrier decks into the center of naval warfare. It had helped decide Midway in minutes. It had smashed Stalingrad, then failed to save the army trapped there. It had forced factories to become battlefields of output. The bomber did not replace soldiers. It did not make war clean. It did not make victory automatic. It made war wider. It pushed fear past front lines. It made distance negotiable. It turned industry into a weapon. It made civilians part of the target system and workers part of the fighting system. It made commanders think not only about armies on the ground, but about fuel, airfields, radar, weather, production rates, and the morale of entire nations. That is why the bomber changed more than combat. It changed the shape of war itself. Before it, a battlefield was a place. After it, the battlefield was anywhere the engines could reach.